in lieu of not covering so much pop culture, I'd like to delve a little bit into a video essay or some such thing around the reasons Skyrim is such a perennial favorite. And now I know that the title maybe or the content of this video sounds a little bit like clickbait or slop or some sort of consideration, but what I wanted to do was to look a bit more at the morphology of, say, Skyrim in general, what it represents. Why is it this touchstone for popular gaming culture? Why is it the most played, the most sold RPG, even after, say, now 13 years and probably in the next 3 or 4, depending if they release another one? I think gaming in general has become the forefront of you might call it the social cultural wars, particularly for young men aged between 14 and 40. There feels as if there is a niche aspect to a very, very popular hobby, which sounds slightly surreal when you consider there's something like 600 million PC gamers, something like this. It's obviously not niche whatsoever. And in general, Skyrim itself having sold, you see here, 60 million copies over its lifetime. So in general, it's obviously the opposite of niche. It's this mainstream effect of a game which has such broad and mass appeal that it feels as if it should be something, say, much more similar to, say, Star Wars or Marvel, but it still has managed to keep its cloistered effect on the cultural aspect of its gaming content, which is to say that you have a game which is not diluted by its fan base. It's not ruined to most degree by, you could say, the soyification of every other property, all other intellectual properties. And why is this? Well, for one thing, once you make a game, that's it. Once it's published, a bit like a movie or a TV show, once it's in the open, then you can't really modify it so much. And so the nature of Skyrim is it was developed off the, you could say, back end of the Bush, start of the Obama era, which was still slightly pre, I would say, this wokeified or you say a more identity politic centric worldview that most of these now, you say, terminally online people do have around who they are, what they are, how that represents them and their politics that follow. Whereas Skyrim was still with the, I say, sincere and genuine respect for both gaming as a hobby, as a pastime, but also the content of its character was representative of a proper delve into a fictional and in this case fantasy narrative. There was a story. Skyrim was the fifth installment in what was a series spanning all the way back into the early 90s, I believe. So the idea that it was entrenched in some sort of sacred level of care. There was this Todd Howard, who's the progenitor, you might call him, of the series, and he had this idea of duty towards the property as something that was precious, because there's an idea that the fans like it for its elements, and its elements become something around how you feel rather than necessarily what you pro and con something on. So because something can push you, it can evoke a feeling in you, a bit like, say, poetry or music or play, then you do get a certain sentimentality towards that idea, that property. And the expansive universe obviously being very commercialized, so our understanding of gaming, obviously, particularly with the unleashing of microtransactions, is that it's servicing shareholder value much more than it is any creative elements that it used to possess, which was why you feel as if modern games are mostly soulless. There's a degree of how much money can we squeeze out of our fan base rather than can I make a piece of art to a degree. And now, I won't say call it high art, but I think video games in general occupy a unique position of being an interactivity of a much deeper degree than most other art. You can almost call it a sporting-like activity where there's an engagement factor that gets you, say, sweaty or adrenaline rushing or whatever have you. But the idea is that you're engaged into the activity, into the hobby, to a degree that's more personal, intrapersonal than, say, a normal, maybe even something like reading a book, for instance, or listening to a song. Now, I think the hopefully broad range of this cynosure here is encapsulated in this adumbration. You have an understanding that Skyrim is a bit more than just a video game, and I do say that without the flippancy, because I genuinely feel as if Skyrim has something transcendental about it. The reason that 60 million people have bought this game, or maybe 30 million people twice have bought this game, is because it has many, many elements in which we consider sacred to the Faustian Gothic soul. Now, I think the very obvious, or almost not even superficial, but the very clear overtones are the Nordic encapsulation. And you can see that here with the warrior. He's obviously being reminiscent, almost of a pastiche or an homage to Viking-ish, pre-medieval Scandinavia. And you have the idea that there's a mythology attached to it, which is reminiscent to a large degree of our own Nordic Scandinavian mythology. And you have dragons, which are very, I think, crucial and key to Norse mythology and in general the Gothic soul. We have in many, many tales the idea that dragons existed alongside of us, and that they were the almost be-all and end-all, the antediluvian nemesis for us, this fiend which was the blight of the lands, and that if you had the hero saga, then the plight was that you would have to give recompense to, come and slay that dragon. I think that's represented here quite well with Skyrim. It's, obviously the idea of quests in general are a big, or destiny and quests in general are big themes and elite motifs in Skyrim, which I think we also appreciate on a soul, on a spiritual level here, is that we have a guy, I think if we took lore, if we took canon, it's a Norse or a Nord guy, man, who's then basically cast out into what is the Skyrim environment through some supernatural machinations, and having to encounter dragons and giants and woolly mammoths, but also much more mundane things like petty politicking from different races and things like this, and what other quests that you can go on, grounds us in both the supernatural and the reality and the realism aspect of what could be a normal fantasy existence. You can be someone who represents someone's heroic saga, but also on the normal level, just a guy hanging around Windhelm or Whiterun or something. So I think for us, it definitely is the value, you could say, creation aspect to it is transcendental for us, both in the lived superficialities. It's how do I go in and enjoy a video game when I'm on my Saturday night for 2 hours, but it also speaks to us more meaningful and deeply because it has this almost blood memory echo, this faint sussering that you can pick up just faintly when you play it, that there's something to this that speaks to your soul. And I think a bit of a segue there, but apropos to that, you have Jeremy Soule creating what is the soundtrack, and the soundtrack here I think is probably, and I don't say this with any hyperbole, is that it's probably the best gaming soundtrack that's ever been produced. Now, the idea that Skyrim as a game and a product is actually, I would say, not even nearly as good as it would be without the soundtrack, is to say it's probably something like a C or a 6 out of 10 game without the soundtrack, because of how much the soundtrack pushes us into the atmosphere of the world and of the universe almost. And how do I feel as if I actually am in Skyrim? It's when you get these soft resonant sounds and tones and harmonies that are basically relayed to you. And I've just taken an excerpt here. I'm not a big Wikipedia guy, but from Wikipedia, where they go in just a little bit on this, and I think it's very important to understand how much critical analysis you could actually, or can be borne out in this soundtrack. In the main theme, Dragonborn, the rhythmic string ostinatos in the A sections of the track exhibit nature clung, while the wash of string harmony in the B sections accomplishes Klangfläche. The woodwinds played in the B section are reminiscent of other static pieces, such as the bird calls in Beethoven's Symphony No. 6, or the forest murmurs sequence in Wagner's Siegfried. Archetypal of both nature clung and Klangfläche is Unbroken Road, which combines the aforementioned elements as well as using reverb to enhance the slow pacing and impress on the listener that they are in a wide landscape. And super added to this, I think, is the opening sequence and the title song, Dragonborn, which uses a foreign language that sounds very reminiscent of what we would intuit as a Norse Nordic language, and how the guttural and the tones and the entire melody is carried towards us very powerfully. It's almost as if there's a Volkish chant to it. And that aspect is obviously very powerful. It's almost soul-filling in that way, that it feels as if it's resonating spiritually to us on a different verve, on a much higher degree than almost anything else you would encounter, particularly for a video game, but in a video game corresponding to that. And I think that probably is why that there's a synergistic effect between the game and the soundtrack that we haven't seen maybe before or since, because there have been several games where soundtracks are actually the part and parcel or the core element to the game. And I think looking at my own Steam library, something like Transistor, but also other games centered around Nordic Norse mythology, that could be something like the Assassin's Creed game, but also Senua and the duology there, which have quite nice soundtracks, but don't quite carry the same weight, the importance. And as it says here, this idea that we can have a reflection and a relationship to some of the greats in music like Beethoven and Wagner is, I think, a testament to obviously Jeremy Soul's talent and skill, but also the idea that there's a certain type of music that serenades us as the Gothic man. It's something that's, as I said before, it's on a antediluvian but almost atavistic level. We have this appeal, and if you can traverse the gap between the Volkish sounds and the high string quartets, this symphony idea, then you really do get something more powerful than any of those two things by themselves. And I think, just as an aside, that it's by far my most listened to album that's not, say, something like a symphony by Beethoven or Bach. So in general, I feel as if you haven't already, you should go back and have a listen to it by itself and try to just embrace and almost meditate with it and see how it fits and sits with you and your Gothic soul, and tap into that a little bit and just see when you do play the game again, if you ever do, that it actually imbues and enhances the experience for you with something, as I said, almost supernatural. And then I think lastly, it's worth mentioning here that the idea that you are what is the ancestor race for yourself. They've obviously portrayed Nords, I think, for the European audience as something where it is your ancestors, and Germanically. Now, I know there's a huge impulse for a lot of particularly gamer types to have an obsession with, say, the ancient Romans, and therefore the choices become much more centered around imperial, say, society, because the armor is reminiscent of ancient Rome, and there's always these small elements which are very easy for us to understand as the Roman pastiche. But for me, I think it's the brutalism with the serenity, how it's combined syncretically, that gives us the most, I would say, powerful but emulsifying effect for our disposition, our will to play. Why is it that I feel as if I should be playing as a Nord? Is because I feel like a Nord. Or if you feel like an elf or something like that, then that can go into the reasoning behind the categorization of the certain splitting of the soul into these archetypes. Why is it that as the inheritors of, and then obviously the associated blood generator of something like fantasy fiction, so the Gothic soul was capable of taking its mythology and able to divulge it, to, say, transvalue it into something that's packaged now as new mythology and fantasy and fiction in a different way than any previous, say, civilization or high culture ever has been able to. If you think of Magian high culture, and particularly around its exploration on the advent of Islam, is that they took their mythology, and they put it into the Quran in these ways that ossified it. It made it very crystallized, so you couldn't get more out of it. Whereas because the Norse and Gothic mythology was a living organism, much like we in our culture are willed to infinite power here, because it grows with us and expands, and we are able to expand it and transform it into different, you could say, visages or aspects. And just one of these is derivations of the original properties. Tolkien, who you could say is the forefather of modern fantasy, really took a lot of his elements from existing mythology from across the Nordic realm, and to that it speaks obviously quite easily to us as a race. We understand it instinctually. It is who we are innately that we understand these things. So I think for me it's very clear as to why the emphasis of modern gaming tends to be hit or miss, is because those designers which maybe aren't Gothic don't understand what works for the Gothic soul. And this is particularly important in an RPG, because the elements behind a role-playing game are things like quests, like destiny, like fate, deeds, reputation, skills, the idea of progression and growth, and how you can expand your power base and potentially even your treasure, your booty, how you feel about that. Becomes almost a moral and ethical position. And this is how we like to create ourselves within ourselves, is almost this reduction of the hyper-reality that Baudrillard talks about, the symbols and representations. And we take semiotics and we say like, oh no, these are all symbols and these are all representative, but they don't actually mean anything. Whereas I think there's actual a reducement here. Something that we've taken back into ourselves is that, no, I can represent myself in a symbol, which actually informs who I am to a larger degree. And this is what you get with Skyrim, and I don't think I'm being, as I said before, hyperbolic or at least grandiose in these statements. I genuinely think this is a masterpiece and probably the pinnacle of gaming for almost any reasons. Maybe not mechanically, and I don't think it's the techniques of gaming that actually should concern us at all. They're a marvel for sure, but it's much more around why is it that there's a certain appeal to a game like Skyrim that has hitherto been unforeseen. And I think those are the primary elements. And there's enough material here, I think, to make it to part 2 and part 3 of this discussion, because there is so much depth to something like this, to this game, that I think almost forever will we have an ability to harken back to this time and say, yes, but how does this compare to Skyrim? And it's not me being mawkish. I genuinely think a game released in 2011 may be the pinnacle of all gaming experiences for the next century.